Judas despised his life and ended it quickly. He went out and committed suicide. But Peter changed his life and lived it fully. One person despised his life and ended it quickly. The other one changed his life and lived it fully. And that's because one of them possessed a godly sorrow and the other a worldly sorrow. One dealt with regret one way, the other person dealt with regret a different way, and it changed everything. I didn't come up with these terms, godly sorrow, worldly sorrow. God did. Here's what we find in 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 10. It says, godly sorrow brings repentance, a change of mind, a change of life, a change of direction that leads to salvation, rescue, and life. And it leaves lingering no regret. But worldly sorrow brings what? Death. Peter had a godly sorrow. It brought repentance, and it brought rescue, and it brought life. Judas had a worldly sorrow, and it brought despair and death. This leads us to a great observation that we need to make sure that we etch in the halls of our mind. To deal with our regrets from our past, we must embrace godly sorrow. We all have regret. We all have things we feel bad about. But we've got to sorrow in a godly kind of way and not in a worldly kind of way, because how we deal with that regret, how we sorrow, dictates everything when it comes to our futures. Now, this just raises a bunch of questions. What in the world is godly sorrow? Right? Well, what is it? And how is that done? Well, perhaps it would help if we kind of understand the dynamics of regret. When we have done something that we regret, there are two voices that start swirling around in our heads. One is the voice of God. It speaks the truth. And if we follow those words, it leads to life. The other is the voice of the devil. It speaks deception. And if we follow that voice, it leads to death. And both of those voices swirl around inside our heads. And let me be honest with you, sometimes it's hard to tell which is which. Because the devil is a counterfeiter, and he can sound kind of like God, just with a twist. But that twist is what makes his word so destructive. What godly sorrow really is it's that sorrow that hears and responds to the voice of God. Godly sorrow is the kind of sorrow that we embrace when we recognize which of the voices swirling around in our heads about our regrets is God's, and we hear it, we believe it, and we follow that voice. So how do you recognize that voice? And therefore, how do you know the sorrow that you feel is a godly sorrow? The kind of sorrow that comes from God that leads to change and life without regret. Essentially, it's by understanding that there are three characteristics that godly sorrow, the kind of sorrow that comes from God, the kind of sorrow that leads to life, always possess. And we need to remember what these are to evaluate the voices in our head when we regret things from our past. First, we need to understand that godly sorrow contains conviction and not condemnation. Conviction. Conviction says, I feel bad about what I've done. I feel guilty over what I've done, and I believe I actually deserve punishment. That's conviction. Feeling bad and guilty over what you have done and believing I deserve some level of punishment for what I've done. That's conviction. Do you know what condemnation is? Condemnation is feeling worthless because of what you have done. and believing you never deserve to have any real good thing happen to you ever again, that's condemnation. If we embrace conviction, it is true and comes from God and leads to life. If we embrace condemnation, it is false, it comes from the devil, and it leads to death. You see, our past regrets, our failures, do not define us. Our failures are real. They cause pain to the heart of God. They cause pain to the heart of others. They are real. And God is hurt. God might even be angry. But listen carefully. Our failures are not all God sees. God still sees the good that we have done. God still sees the gifts that we possess. God still understands the potential of our lives, and therefore God never writes us off. God never puts us on a no blessings list, ever. You know, one of the big news stories, at least in the National Football League, otherwise known as the epicenter of life in America. One of the biggest news stories this year is the return of Michael Vick to the NFL. Where did he return from, you may ask? For the two of you in here that do not know, he returned from prison. He was in federal prison for almost 2 years. He formerly had been a star all-pro quarterback for the Atlanta Falcons. But it turns out he was involved in a dog fighting operation. And as bad as that may sound, once you understand what went on, it is far worse. The way animals were tortured and abused and killed in slow and painful ways. The way gambling took place over this. And then when it got found out, he lied under oath to a grand jury. The evidence came forward, he was convicted, and he lost his career, he lost his contracts, he lost what looked like his future, and he went to prison. And after 2 years, he was released. Roger Goodell, the commissioner of the NFL, decided that he would conditionally reinstate Michael Vick to the NFL. But what I found very interesting, on the day his reinstatement was announced, Tony Dungy, a former coach in the NFL for the Indianapolis Colts, released a statement. Turns out Tony Dungy had been in conversation with Michael Vick for months. And amidst a chorus of people going, his crimes were too great. Sports is a privilege. You don't deserve a second chance. He should not be allowed back in the NFL for the crimes he committed and the abuse that he committed and the lying that he did and everything else. But listen to what Tony Dungy said. He said, over the last 2 months, I've been in contact with Michael Vick. My role has been only to assist him, to answer questions, and to give my advice to a young man who is trying to get his life back. I have agreed to be a part of that team that will try to help him. I'm going to be speaking and meeting with Michael on a regular basis. I have agreed with Michael to do this even before talking to the NFL offices, and my involvement will be to help Michael in any way that I can. My hope is that Michael continues on the course that he's been on for the last couple of months. I don't know what future will hold for him. I'm sure that will be discussed at length by the news outlets. But I think Michael deserves a chance to show people he's changed and learned from his past mistakes. I know the public will be skeptical, but I think over time, people will find there's a different side to him than what they've seen so far. And that's really my goal, to help let people see the other side of Michael Vick. Tony Dungy looked past the crimes and past the perversions and past the violence, and he saw that those things, as bad as they were, did not define Michael Vick. There were good things in there too, and he refused to write him off and said, I'm going to come alongside and help him to have a better future. And what Tony Dungy did for Michael Vick is what God does for every single one of us.